That's it. Things are finally changing on the Ukrainian front. I told you since February the Ukrainians have regained more territory than they've lost. The Russians keep pushing and launching offensives, but they're actually retreating. See my video where I discuss how Ukrainians are winning the drone war on the battlefield. But now something fundamental is also happening in the strategic campaign. The front line is good for Putin's propaganda when he says he's taken 3 villages while he's lost 5 on the other side. But today it's actually long-range warfare. And in long-range warfare since March, the Ukrainians have been firing more long-range missiles, FPVs, flamingos, UDs, and so on, than what the Russians are able to fire. And on top of that, there are more direct hits. But where there is a strategic shift is what's been happening since last week, with direct and large-scale strikes directly on Moscow, including drone tests that the Russians are unable to stop. First, I'll show you a segment from LCI last night about this topic, then explain the reasons for this success.
These are truly incredible images we've been seeing for several days now, where the Ukrainians are able to strike repeatedly, very visibly and very effectively in Moscow. Say a word about this, Xavier Teitelman. Drones, once again, just like we saw previously with Iran, we have a dimension that was truly unimaginable just a few years ago.
So strategically, the Ukrainians have gained the advantage on the front with drones to really lift the front line. And over long distances since March, the Ukrainians have 2 things. They fire more than the Russians, partly because Iran stopped supplying Shahed drones, which affects the volume. But roughly speaking, the Ukrainians produce between 200 and 250 very long-range drones per day, including cruise missiles, etc., which can reach up to 2,700 kilometers for the most distant strikes. And what was surprising was also the ability to completely get through the air defense lines that had been set up during the May 8th parade. The Russians built up 3 lines of air defense, and it went through in broad daylight. Normally, they try to do this at night to avoid being detected by those who are going to shoot. The Ukrainians managed to spend 2 days crossing all the defense lines right into the heart of Moscow, 3 kilometers from the Kremlin, to strike oil infrastructure, strategic sites, and factories. They focused everything on the city at once. I was in Kiev on Saturday and didn't know what was going on. There was a celebration. Everyone played music and blasted the radio. It was 2000.
And it became a slogan. Let me read it to you. So there is a person in charge of drones in Ukraine whose name is Robert Brovdy. And he became a kind of star over there, obviously, because he's the man who organizes all of this. And he says, from now on, Moscow will never sleep again.
I like how techno music is everywhere, with car windows open and everyone listening, creating a party vibe. All right, let's get back to our topic.
Look, listen carefully to this sequence. You can hear the Russians shouting because this time the war is really at their doorstep, right? I've heard testimonies where people on planes make the sign of the cross before taking off from Moscow because they think a drone could hit their plane at any moment.
Yeah, but...
It's those who follow.
Well...
Apparently, the Ukrainians are going to do the same thing the Russians did in Kyiv. You can see there, they're firing at a civilian building, exactly what the Russians have done for years. It's not just a building, it's a civilian building. And
these are the images and
of
targeted killings too?
That is to say, okay, so these are actually targets. No, it was then in the agreements, an apartment building.
It's a civilian apartment building. And it was the floor where an official lived.
No, but I'm sure there were deaths in a civilian building. Collateral damage is inevitable. The perfect world doesn't exist. They're exporting the war they've endured for years to Russia. That's it, plain and simple.
Yes, but there's still a breath. The objectives remain until it's a man, or, yes, I agree, it's not possible. Yes, an uneven circle.
It's like the story of the scooter that jumped over the bridge.
You have to remember the phrase she said to Trump and that Trump repeated. She supposedly told him last week or 10 days ago, he told him Russia is in a bad situation, a tough spot, and next year the situation will be catastrophic for the Russians.
Should we also highlight Zelensky's skill? He survived everything, right? Everything. It's still very impressive. Some American reports suggest he's distancing himself from U.S. oversight, believing he can eventually do without them.
And he's freeing himself from the so-called red lines. He survived every so-called red line, massively striking Moscow. But back in 2022, we were told if there were Caesar howitzers in Lutter, we would get hit by Russian missiles. And now he's massively striking Moscow. And the most interesting thing is these other videos where you see Russians filming themselves on Telegram. They ask Ukrainians, what did we do to you? It shows the level of the Iron Curtain in Russia, where many people don't even know there's actually a war going on.
But what we also see here once again is Putin waving his bombs, his nuclear missiles, since the beginning of this war in Ukraine. Here we see the capital of a country that has a nuclear weapon being bombed for weeks. A few weeks ago, St. Petersburg was being bombed in a very similar way because there are also oil refineries. The explosions and fires were so strong that they could be seen from Estonia. And of course, Russia is responding by bombing Ukraine. But we don't have that nuclear catastrophe that everyone was afraid of at the beginning of the war. As I've said for 4.5 years, if we'd armed Ukraine properly from the start, this war would be over.
About nuclear weapons?
I tell everyone we could have gained 2 years.
And something is happening there, right? This is an announcement according to the commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Oleksandr Syrsky. Ukrainian soldiers have managed for the first time to carry out more offensives on the front than the Russians have.
Since February, the Ukrainians have been taking back territory from the Russians. That means the front line has been reversed due to the dominance of drones. Who is it really? Basically, you have to understand that from the end of 2024, the Russians put everything into fiber optics, all their technologies, all their industrialization, and it was a dead end. The Ukrainians, of course, today, they're launching 40,000 fiber optic drones per month, which is still quite a lot. But besides that, artificial intelligence is more effective than drones, than fiber optics. Relays resistance to jamming are more effective than fiber optics, and the Russians, their main fiber optic factory was destroyed by Ukrainian bombings. And Chinese production, they've tripled the price, so the Russians are struggling on the front. So as you've seen, there's an accumulation of destruction on the territory of the Russian Federation, whether it's giant refineries like Chelyabinsk or Ryazan. And in the end, 21 of the 38 largest Russian refineries have been either damaged, totally destroyed, or shut down. On top of that, at least 300 fuel tanks have been confirmed destroyed, just based on the images the Ukrainians have been able to provide us from the attacks, because once again, all these attacks are documented. In total, for the Russians, that's about $10 billion in direct material damage just to the refineries. These destructions obviously prevent Russia from exporting its fuel, and that represents another loss of $40 billion for the Russian economy. On top of that, there's obviously more than $80 billion in costs from sanctions. Since Russian oil can no longer be sold at the normal price since the beginning of the war. And then you also have to consider the cost of exports, which has skyrocketed for the Russians, since they have to buy a fleet of tankers. We're talking about billions of dollars that have been invested to buy old, worn-out ships. So that's an extra cost of between $5 and $15 related to exports, just to protect their fleet against Ukrainian naval drones, against possible interceptions all over the place, escorts, and so on. So all of this is causing the Russian oil windfall, which was 100% dedicated to the military budget, to collapse. 40% of the state budget comes from oil and gas. 40% of the state budget was used to support the war in Ukraine. So today, they are in an economic situation, I'll refer you to the previous videos, that is very complicated. But what's interesting is how the Ukrainians are achieving these results. First, there has been an improvement in intelligence. The Ukrainians can now much more easily identify where the Russian air defense systems are located than in the past, notably with triangulation methods, without going into detail. For example, they have sensors. These can be on drones, on balloons, or on systems that are on the ground. And then very quickly, they will be able to triangulate. They sense that there is a radar there. They sense that the radar is there. At the interception point, they send a drone. The drone goes to find its target. Sometimes a human pilot flies it all the way to impact. Either there are automatic recognition systems with shape recognition, which will allow it to be destroyed without having a human in the loop. Even in jammed, GPS-denied environments, artificial intelligence enables reaching the impact point. Next, the Ukrainians are bringing new drones into service. I have already talked about it several times. There are 6 that are supposed to enter service at the beginning of this year. We're now seeing new equipment arrive that's a clear improvement over previous systems, with greater resistance to jamming and electronic warfare. The Ukrainians are also managing to set up communication networks that allow them to go farther and farther by releasing weather balloons that act as relays. So there's no longer a need for satellite control like we had with Starlink. So there are a lot of new resources. Some of these drones now feature stealth technology. So we really have an ecosystem that's developing, and an acceleration that's fundamental, that's very important. I see it, I talk with these people. The t-shirt I'm wearing, it comes from the unit. One of 3 battalions conducting long-range strikes. An interview with Leader Casper is coming soon, who have a very optimistic outlook. Then there's an important element. It's targeting. The Ukrainians, forced by circumstances, have developed their defense industry in very small spaces, in garages and so on. There are many small entities, so when one is destroyed, which happens as Russians keep firing, though most of their missiles fortunately miss, it's not a major loss. Their long-range drones are intercepted, though some still get through. When infrastructure is destroyed, well, all the others keep working. The difference is that the Russians, in addition, have to strike at night, because during the day they're visible, and there are a lot more, gun crews who can intercept them. It's much easier, so they have to strike at night. Fortunately, that's when the factories aren't operating, so there are fewer casualties. Whereas on the Russian side, they don't have lots of small infrastructures. They have gigantic Soviet-style factories, which the Ukrainians can now hit from up to 3,000 kilometers away, so it's obviously effective. Ukrainian strikes are landing more hits on target than on the Russian side, more volume fired. The Ukrainian side is better protected than the Russian side, which has less secure targets. So overall, that's what we're seeing. An acceleration in the number of Ukrainian strikes. And why is it that the Russians today can't intercept all these missiles, which are ultimately low-cost missiles? That's exactly what we saw in Iran. The Iranians fired a lot of low-cost systems, Shahed and others, at the United States and their allies in the Gulf region and the Gulf countries. They lack the Ukrainian low-cost, user-friendly, and more effective systems compared to the Patriot systems. Now the Russians are doing the same. They had 3 or 4 lines of defense around the capital, Moscow. Panzer systems fire large numbers of missiles, but poor targeting means they often miss. Things made of carbon fiber or with stealth technology. An ecosystem that's being set up, which is amazing. So the Russians are also trying to develop these small, inexpensive interceptors, just like everyone else. In fact, just like us, like the Americans. Everyone would like to have the Ukrainians' expertise in this field. The Russians are learning the hard way that it's not that easy, and they know very well that their missiles are running out. Their launchers, they've already lost more than half of them. They can't produce enough to keep up with these attacks. The Russians are facing what we would face against them today. If the Russians were firing at us, we would be in the same predicament that the Russians are experiencing today against the Ukrainians. There you go. So, maybe an ironic point. Well, do you remember at the beginning of the war when you had the Russian propagandists laughing at the misfortune of the Ukrainians who were suffering from these attacks? The only big difference is that the Ukrainians, when they shoot at legitimate targets. Even when it's in buildings, in apartment blocks, they manage to hit the floor where you have a Russian official responsible for war crimes who is identified and targeted. It's good, effective, and only speeds things up. And I think that in the long term, the Ukrainian strategic objective is to achieve a collapse of Russia's economy. There's a problem right now. Oil is more expensive because of Trump's war in Iran. If it stops, if the 3 arms reopen, the possible level of funding for Russia will start to decrease again. I worry the Russians might hold out until next winter, and really, Russia needs to be economically bled dry and decide to put this war on pause. It won't be peace. In my opinion, it'll be like it was from 2014 to 2022, with a fake ceasefire, a truce that the Russians will violate every day, but at a much lower level. Because next winter, if the Ukrainians start suffering attacks on their energy infrastructure again, which we should be defending, by the way, but we're not helping them hold on. Well, in that case, I'm not sure the Ukrainians will be able to get through the winter from an electrical standpoint, which means the production of drones, armored vehicles, artillery, and ammunition might not be able to continue. And supplying the front line sufficiently. That's my main concern. Ukrainians will push harder, move faster, and strike more forcefully, with some allies beginning to assist. Whereas these are technologies that are 100% sovereign, they no longer rely on the Americans for any of these technologies. The question is, will they be strong enough to make Russia give in more quickly? As for the arrival of winter, that is to say December, January, February, we can only hope for that. But when you have the Chinese who are starting to officially tell the Americans, let's say, Russia is doing very badly, when the statistics are bad, we can still hope to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I hope you enjoyed it, and sorry for the lack of illustration. I wanted to make a very quick video as well because I was there last week and I saw a lot of interesting things. And the morale of the Ukrainians is higher than I've seen it before. Even in 2023, so that's still indicative of the general situation. I hope you enjoyed it.